What's this video about? Well, it's about the mission control functionality that's been built into RAF Virtuals SCI version 2.11. What will it cover? It'll talk about what is mission control, provide an overview of the new features that have been introduced, talk a little bit about what smart targets are, the changes to the user interface, creating various types of targets, and in the end creating and using a mission file which combines all of these things together. Mission control allows you to create targets within your flight simulator. They can be static or moving. Why would you want to do it? Well, you can build your own missions, as well as having other players, other pilots flying with you in multiplayer mode. You can also add to your simulation targets under your control that you move around. Now, whilst you can control them, the control's limited to preset controls. They're visible in multiplayer mode, and TACPAC is aware of them, and they can be destroyed. Moving targets are also visible on the AWAC radar that our fighter combat controllers use. How you actually use it? Well, that's up to you. The new features in this release, there's three main items. The airdrop and mission control editor have been separated into two separate interfaces. The mission control functions are now contained within one window, with tabs allowing you to select and navigate between the items. And smart targets have been introduced, and these are controlled outside of the flight simulator by our own control algorithms, giving us a lot more flexibility as to how we want to make them fly or move around on the ground and the sea. With smart targets, there are three flight modes available: a fighter, an airliner, and a ground or sea target. You can see the characteristics of each type there. Basically, they have a range of speed and turn capabilities and vertical speed capabilities that can be used when you're creating a target. There is no model for helicopters, so I'd suggest you just use the airliner mode and choose some sensible values when you create the target. You don't really want a helicopter flying at 1,000 knots, but in case of an airliner that'll be 450 knots, but you can choose 100, 120 knots, and the turn rates and other vertical speed capabilities will fly it as a helicopter would fly. With smart targets, there are three options you can choose, as you'll see shortly when we look at the user interface. There's an evade mode. When selected, the target will detect any other piloted RAF-V aircraft within range, and it will automatically evade that aircraft when the aircraft gets within 70 nautical miles. And if it's a ground or sea target, the RAF-V aircraft has to be within about 30 nautical miles. The actual distance is randomised, so it'll be plus or minus those figures. Once a RAF-V aircraft is no longer within that evade range, the target will return back to its flight plan or its waypoint plan and continue on as it was before it detected the RAF-V aircraft. Boxed in is the other mode. It allows you to define a zone plan or a box or polygon, and once assigned to a target, it will always remain within that zone. If you don't assign a waypoint plan, it'll just fly random paths within the zone, but it will never leave that zone. Patrol mode, as it says, it's designed to have an aircraft patrolling a border or some area of airspace, or even land if you want it to be a vehicle, or the ocean if it's a ship. If there is a waypoint plan assigned, it'll follow that waypoint, but it won't follow it exactly each time. It'll randomly vary the waypoints within 5 nautical miles of each waypoint within the plan. If you haven't assigned a waypoint and you've boxed it in, it'll follow random paths, but it'll stay within that boxed in zone. You can combine these various modes together. For instance, you could have an evade target that's boxed in, and in that case, even when a RAF-V aircraft is detected, it will evade it, but once it gets to the edge of the box or the zone plan, it will turn and always turn and remain within the box. It will never leave the zone that you've defined as the box. Now that I've bored you with the PowerPoint slide, it's time to have a look at the SCI interface. As I said earlier, airdrop control and mission control now have two separate areas and can be selected individually. Mission control now is all in the one window, as you can see, with the mission control panel, waypoint planner and zone planner as tabs. You can just select those and go back to the main one, or you can also select the waypoint planner and the zone planner from these buttons. We're currently not connected to the simulator, so the mission control panel is in pre-planned target editor mode. This is the same as the mission control editor, but in this mode you create targets outside of the flight simulator and you can save them. The functions that don't work are just my location, because you don't have a location in the flight simulator because it's not connected, and you can't display call signs again because you're not connected to the simulator. As you'll see later, when we connect to the simulator, this panel is almost exactly the same as the mission editor panel. There are now target types. Instead of one long list, you can choose aircraft, buildings, etc., ships, and then you have the target objects within there that you can choose out of the list to create your targets. Waypoint plan, there aren't any at the moment, and no zone plans, and we'll talk about those shortly. And the usual boxes to put in: latitude, longitude, heading, speed and altitude. The altitude is above ground level. And if the target is a ship or a vehicle, you'll need to make sure that you've clicked target on the ground. This is a new component, the smart targets I spoke about earlier. You can select the type of flight mode you want, and then you can select the various options for the smart target. I'll just connect to the flight simulator for a second, and you'll see that we now have the mission editor in place of the pre-planned editor. Looks exactly the same as the pre-planned editor, but now you have my location because one exists within there. Display call signs will be available as soon as there are targets in the list, and you can save targets once you've actually created targets or loaded existing targets. The use of this is within the simulator. You can create the targets, you can see them if you're in the simulator, you can position them where you want them, whereas a pre-planned is you're working outside the simulator and you're just using the map to create targets where you want them to be, plus their flight plans. So we'll just disconnect and go back to the pre-planned editor and create a couple of static targets to show you the basics of what you can do. So in this case we'll go for buildings. We'll put a few armed guards, and we will put them on the airfield at Williamtown. Now we need to have a position for them. The easiest way is just to click on where you want them to be, and automatically you get the lat and long. Heading will be the direction they look in, but it's pretty immaterial for soldiers. They won't be going anywhere, and they'll have a 0 altitude and they're on the ground. It's just a matter of creating that target. Whoops. As you can see, I've tried to create a smart target with a speed of less than 1 knot, which you can't do because I'd left the smart target button selected from earlier. So I just need to disconnect that, and now I can create the target. You can now save those targets. Again, can't display the call sign because I'm not connected to the flight simulator at the moment. I can add another armed guard next to it just by clicking next to it. Keep all the same parameters. As I've clicked, there's a new lat and long, and I'll create another one of them. Now I'll give them something to guard. I might choose as a chemical tank that I'll just put to the other side of them there. Happy for the heading and speed and altitude to be the same. And I've created it. So now we have 3 targets that we can save as a mission file, and they can be loaded in at any time in the future. And if you just quickly go through, what you can see is obviously the names of the target, the parameters you assign to them. We have no flight plans, they're all on the ground. They're not smart targets, so the rest of this is immaterial. I might say target type is fighter, but if that's false, they're not a smart target, so it has no effect at all. Save the targets, it's quite simple. You can just save them as whatever you want, and they're saved away. You can now delete them individually if you want to, and you can see they disappear from the screen. At any point you can just hover over the buttons and you'll see what the target's names are. If you've got 2 of them, then you can just click on the target itself and it will put a marker next to that target. so that you can see which of the armed guards if I happen to have 2 of them there. I can delete all the targets. Because I've saved them as a file, I can load them as pre-planned. I can choose to append them to any existing targets I've got. Don't have those at the moment. Or I can choose I want to override existing targets. Doesn't matter in this case, I can choose that. Pick up the My Demo and they're there. If I choose load pre-planned and I say I want to overwrite, I can load the same ones again if I wanted to, and I've now got 2 sets of those targets. Or I can say I'll load new targets but I'll override existing. It just deletes what's there and puts the other ones in place. I'll get rid of those. Targets that move, quite straightforward. With targets that move, you've got the option of a normal target, as in one that's controlled by Flight Simulator, or you've got the option of a smart target. If you don't select smart target, it's a normal target controlled by Flight Simulator. So we can choose to have an aircraft, make it a Chinook helicopter. We need to give it some sort of plan, even though we've got a location for it, and say we give it a speed of 100 knots and we put it up at 200 feet above the ground. It will now just fly for 100 knots at a heading of 350 and remain 200 feet above the ground and just continue in that direction forever. If you wanted to do something different to make it fly around the airfield, you can create a waypoint plan. You need to give it a name. We'll just call it Wide Williamtown for the sake of something better. I'm now using that flight plan. I need to have lat and longs, which I can do by clicking. I need to give it the altitude, and I put it at 200 feet before, so I'll keep that the same, and I had it running at 100 knots. So I can now choose my first waypoint, add it in. I'll keep the same altitude and speed, or I might want to, for the next leg, I might want to speed it up a bit to say 120 knots. I can create the next waypoint and add it in. So once it gets to this waypoint, it will increase the speed from then on. I can add another one over there. I'll keep the same settings. The waypoint's not on the ground because this aircraft is obviously in the air. Let's continue putting the plans in place. Now I can save that plan, and then once I've created the target with that plan, it will fly through these waypoints. When it gets to the last one, it will just go back to the first one. If I click Do Not Loop, you can only do that if you're on the ground. So in this case, I can't click Do Not Loop, so it will just continue around the plan. If you're on the ground, I'll just click on the ground now to allow that to happen and click Do Not Loop. Then if this was a ground target, when it gets to the very last waypoint, it will continue with whatever the settings in that waypoint are. If you'd have made that a 0 speed, then when it gets to that, it will stop at that waypoint and just sit there. If you kept that speed, it will just continue on in that direction forever at the speed and heading that the last leg of that waypoint plan was. I won't do either of those this time, and I'll save the plan. It's now closed. I can't add any more waypoints to that because I've closed the plan off and it's completed. I can now, that plan's automatically been added onto that aircraft. I could choose to make it none if I wanted to, but in this case I want to create a Chinook with that. I need to have a starting position, so I'll show the plan. I'll start the aircraft near where its first waypoint is, so that it can then track from there on. Remove the on the ground because this target's not on the ground, and I've got the speed and heading. In this case the heading's about 120, 140 to get to that waypoint, so I'll put that in there and create the target. So now we have a target that will fly that flight plan at the parameters we've set and be controlled by Flight Simulator. If I wanted to, I could create a smart target and choose that I want to actually keep it flying within a box. To do that, I've got to go to the zone planner, create a zone, which we'll just call box. Because you only need lat and long, just clicking on the map will create the zone points for the zone plan. Now I want to show all flight plans so I can actually see that flight plan, because the flight plans have to be within the zone. If it's not, you'll get an error message when you try and use that combination of flight plan and zone plan. So I'll just create a nice big box. I don't close it off, because by closing the zone, that does it automatically and it's closed. If I go back, I now have a zone plan and a waypoint plan, and if I show the zone, that's what it is. So this aircraft, and I can turn on evade. So now I have, and I'll click airliner because I've chosen a Chinook, although I could easily have just said, okay, I'll have a jet aircraft, I'll have a fighter. And it will now follow that flight plan. If evade mode is triggered, it will evade the RAFV aircraft that triggered it, but it will always stay within the zone that's been defined. And it's just a matter of, I need to, in this case I'll go back to the helicopter because the speeds that I've defined are more suitable to that for the flight plan. And we've got our heading still set correctly, so we can create that target. And now you'll see that it is a smart target. I left it as a fighter, which was not the smart thing to do, but that doesn't matter because the speeds are quite low, so it'll follow those speeds anyway. When it evades though, it will evade with the speed of a fighter, which is not what you'd expect to see for a helicopter. It's got a zone plan named box, and the evade mode is set. Now if you switch and connect to the flight simulator, that takes us into the mission editor, and you'll notice we have no targets. They're still there, it's just that the mission editor has its own list of targets that are live within the simulator. At the moment we have none, but if we disconnect, we go back to the pre-planned editor and the targets that we've created are there. Again, we can save those off to another file. We can delete them all, we've saved them. If we now connect into the simulator, we can load a pre-planned, and that will load those targets and they will commence flying around. If I hide the plans and hide the zone, I can now display the call signs, and you'll see that the Chinook we created has no because it's moving too slowly at this stage, it has no call sign, and the other two Chinooks are following the flight plan that we'd laid out, and as they're identical, they're heading in the same direction. Now for the last part of the video, I've loaded a pre-planned file that I'd already created earlier. As you can see, all the targets are loaded. I'm connected to the simulator and I'm connected to the FSD data link. There are a number of stationary targets, a couple of 3-armed guards and a chemical tank. I've got some ground vehicles driving around, and we have a Chinook, a Tu-95 and a MiG-23 flying around. Within Flight Simulator, there's also a ship that's out to sea. This particular ship was on a do not loop plan with the last leg set to stop, and the ship in fact has now completed the short plan that I put in place, and it's sitting stationary in the ocean, and you can see the others flying around, as well as the stationary targets on the ground at the airfield. This particular aircraft has been set up, the MiG-23 has been set up as 500 feet above the ground, and I've created a flight plan that takes it over the mountains so that as it approaches any rising or falling ground, it acts a little bit like a terrain following radar in that it will climb and descend based on the ground underneath it. That particular aircraft is a bit further up to the north, but again we can click on quickly and we'll see where it is, and if we show the plans you can see that it's planned to fly over the Barrington Tops National Park and then continue on around the rest of the flight plan. And that's it for the demonstration. Enjoy the new features.